There's a pretty awkward construction in Colossians 1:6 and a couple of pretty interesting issues with epigonota. Tu parantos eis humas, kathos kai en panti to cosmo, esten carpa pharumenon kai auxanamenon, kathos kai en humin, of heis hemeras, ekusete kai epiginoska tein charin tu theou en aletheia. The grammar of this verse won't become totally clear until we phrase it, but let's get the words down. So building off of the mention of the gospel in verse 6, Paul continues that this gospel has come among you all, just as also in all the world, and then here's where it's a little strange, is. Well, what does esten hook into? We'll see that in a second. But the gospel is bearing fruit, and it's growing, it's increasing, just as also among you all. In other words, it's bearing fruit and growing in the world, just as it is bearing fruit and growing among the Colossians. From which day? Now, there's a footnote in the grammar about this, but this is just a really odd expression. Bauer suggests that it's a shortened form of apa, tes, hemeris, and then the relative pronoun, heis. But what's happened here is that the article was dropped and the relative pronoun was brought forward. And what's really strange about this is the antecedent of heis is hemeris. So here's a case where the antecedent is coming after the relative pronoun. But it's just kind of an odd expression. Don't worry about it. So from which day you heard, and we're going to come back and talk about this, but this is a compound of epi plus ginosko, isn't it? So it's a straight aorist. You heard about the grace of God in truth. Okay, there's a couple things I need to point out about epigonota. This could be what's called an ingressive, or I always have called it an inceptive aorist. In other words, the aorist could be calling attention to the beginning of the action. Remember, the aorist describes an action from the outside, looks at it as a whole, but it still could be emphasizing the beginning of the whole action, or in other uses, maybe the end of the whole action. This is why you can use the word began to with an aorist. Now, no translation does that, but here's why I think you need to think about that. Think about what Paul is saying. So from the day that you heard about it and understand. Well, would you have understood it the first day that you heard about it? It seems to me more that he's saying is that when you heard the gospel, you began to understand. Here's the other thing. Because this is a compound verb with epi is a preposition, but it's also a combining form that can indicate emphasis. This explains some of the translations. Most of them just say, and understood. So that's the NASB, the ESV, and over in the net the same. But look what's going on here. With the NRSV, they say truly comprehend. CSB, truly appreciate. NIV, truly understood. Okay, where are those words coming from? Well, they're coming from the fact that epi is a combining form that can add emphasis. Now, the tricky thing is in this word, as is often the case, it doesn't always add emphasis. If you look at BDAG, you can see that epiginosko means to have the knowledge of something with the preposition, that's the epi, making its influence felt, know exactly, completely, through and through. And that's where they put Colossians 1. But it doesn't have to bring emphasis. And in these kinds of situation, In this particular word, epiginosko would be synonymous with gnosko. Notice that, by the way, that Bauer lists verbs in their infinitive form, not in their indicative form. But anyway, so you have to make a choice based on context. So you could say, if it was an inceptive, it's easy to say that you began to know, you began to more fully understand. Or if that's being too specific, it could be just you truly understood. But I just don't think you truly understand the gospel from the very beginning. I think you grow into a knowledge of it. So I would tend to say, from the day which you heard and began to more fully understand the grace of God in truth. But we're going to go ahead and phrase it because it's going to really helpful here. So it became present among you, just as also in all the world. And then you get the estin here, just as it's bearing fruit and it is growing, just as also among you, from which day you heard, and at this point, I got to shrink the text. You heard and you came to understand the grace of God, and then prepositional phrases on their own. Okay, so it's the gospel, and the gospel has come to them, and it's come to you all. Just as also in all the world. In other words, the gospel came to the Colossians, just as it came to the entire world. And then you have the estin. Now, the subject of estin is gospel, right? The gospel is bearing fruit and growing. But it's an awkward construction because at the first part, it sounds like he's saying the gospel has come to you in Colossae, just as it's come in all the world. And then he switches and he says, well, that gospel is bearing fruit and growing. So it's kind of an odd grammatical construction. And what you have to decide in your exegesis is in all the world, does that parallel coming, or is in all the world, does it parallel bearing fruit and growing? Be an interesting class discussion, I think. I'm going to go ahead and put a tab out for here because I want these things parallel. And it's bearing fruit and it's growing just as also as it is among you all. In other words, just as also as it's growing in you, it's also growing in the world. Awkward Greek, okay? And then, actually, I think what I'm going to do is I should indent that understanding that the kathos phrase is going back to both of those participles, okay? Well, when did it start bearing fruit and growing in Colossae? Well, it started from the very day that you heard it. We'll put another tab in here. And came to understand. What did you understand? And here we're just going to have to pull it back some because I'm running out of room. The grace of God. And then it's kind of interesting, where do you think the aletheia goes? What is in truth? Well, at first blush, I would guess it goes there, that they heard and they have come to know in the truth, about the grace of God in the truth. So again, you're going to have to really connect those things with the grace. Paul will often do this where there's lots of little phrases and they don't always flow nicely from one to the next, and you've got to kind of figure it out. Okay, Paul, where are you going with this? But anyway, you know what I think is a better way to do that is to line up the kathos phrases. And to make it really clear, you may want to mark them some way. So, just as in all the world, so also among you. But chronologically, it'd be in reverse order. You can see why this is such an interesting verse, isn't it? Because when you start up at the beginning, it came to the Colossians, just as in all the world. It's bearing fruit and growing, just as also on you. So I think initially the bearing fruit and the growing, Paul is thinking of the gospel in the world. So in other words, it's going back up to here. But then he says, oh, what it's doing in the whole world is what it has done among you all. So if you want to line up the kathos phrase that way, that makes the structure a little easier to see.